This episode is brought to you by the Drippers and Spitters Art Academy. Drippers and Spitters was started by the revolutionary community of creators in reaction to the dull, hidebound, fully representational traditions of the Fechin school of art. Now, you're thinking, do I have what it takes to excel at the Drippers and Spitters Art Academy? Well, they've developed a pretest to assess your artistic aptitude. Just go to their website and download one of their assessment images. They're cartoony pictures of a deer or a turtle or a funny-looking man. Now, carefully, working from the template image, splatter colored goo liberally on a separate piece of paper. Or better, take a felt tip pen and put it to the paper and just leave it there for 2 minutes to let the paper soak up the ink in a big black blotch. Then fold up your copied image and put it in an envelope with $1 to the DNS Art Academy. Their expert faculty will carefully examine your work to determine whether it's recognizable as anything in the Increate's dimly lit earth. And they'll get back to you with their own encouraging, open-minded assessment. And use the promo code REREAD, one word, to download their advanced assessment images of a cat or bunny rabbit. And thank you, Drippers and Spitters Art Academy, for sponsoring the Rereading Wolfe podcast.
Warning. The following discussion is deliberately riddled with spoilers and unhinged speculation on this nearly 40-year-old book, Gene Wolfe's The Book of the New Sun. You can't read a Gene Wolfe story. You can only reread a Gene Wolfe story.
Welcome to Rereading Wolfe. We'll abandon the literary artifice that this is the first time you and we have read these books. We're going to try to understand, and that means considering the books as a whole.
Hi, I'm James Wynn.
And I'm Craig Brewer. Well, we had a lot of activity this last week. In fact, honestly, so much that we're probably not going to be able to comment on everyone. So I apologize, but that's wonderful. And as we've said many times, there's a lot of good stuff that is happening, especially on the Facebook page. A few things we wanted to talk about before we get into the chapter. One thing, we were going to mention something before, actually, from a couple weeks ago, and we didn't get a chance to last time.
Filippo Di Paola had a really interesting theory that you should really check out. It's from it's a September 14th post. I think he has a separate one as well earlier. Mm-hmm. And basically his theory has to do with the identity of the body in the grave that Vodalis and Thea dug up was Thecla. And I frankly love this theory because of the dark hair of the woman they drag out and the white gown that she's wearing. And there's nothing more than I want to figure out exactly how to put that together. So give his theory a check.
And I will say we're not without questions about it. I mean, it does immediately bring up timeline issues of how that would happen. And you'd have some people going back and forth in time after her death to get there. And he has some ideas about how that might have happened. But I think the main thing that does do that is that the details there between her dress and the hair, it would fit and it would match up. And we get so little description of her, and we do get some specific things about Thecla that it does make you wonder, why did Wolfe choose those same details? Mm-hmm. And if this was the case, this is one way that it could be her.
I am really stuck with this theory. I love it because of the association with the hair and the white gown. It's not the only reason I like it, and I think it fits. I can't quite work out all the timeline issues, but maybe if Severian had an ability to travel in time because of his association with the claw, and he takes everyone with him for a short while, he takes the volunteers with him into the future after Thecla has died and been buried, then that kind of makes sense. But then, it's very complicated.
Yeah.
But I want this to be true.
It would change a lot of things about my understanding of what's going on in these first chapters. I got to admit that.
That's true.
But I feel like it's something that because of those details, you got to at least consider it.
Sure. Yeah.
Well, thank you for that one. That one's definitely something we can hash out online, and maybe in the future with some other things that I know that might connect to it. Speaking of future, there's a bad segue, but so another comment, Ariel Bear on Facebook also was just wondering in general, how far into the future does the New Sun take place? That's a good question, actually, because I think there are a lot of assumptions about what it is, but there is also some details that we find out later. But we didn't talk about this when we were talking about it before. We just talked about it as the extreme future.
Well, Wolfe has made gestures that it's like 1,000,000 years in the future.
He's made gestures that way, and then he's also said things, and there's questions in the book that suggest that it's nowhere near that far in the future. Yeah. So that's why it's confusing. So just to start off, Jack Vance, if we're thinking that he's just totally copying the dying Earth thing, then this would be so far in the future that the sun is naturally dying out, which is what happens in Vance's books, unless I'm totally forgetting something. But, so we're totally talking about the sun burning out millennia into the future. That could be. There's another possibility, though, that this is more likely thousands or tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of years in the future. What would happen then is there's some suggestions that the sun has a worm in it, is what they call it, that's been leeching off the energy. And so something's been tampering with it. And that means that it's dying out far sooner than it should. Plus, you have little things like the fact that Jonas recognizes a Korean name. If we're talking about millions of years in the future, I would assume that everything is totally forgotten. But that would have to be at least in, some kind of proximity to...
Right. Yeah, because otherwise, Jonas, the people he encountered wouldn't even be remotely recognizable as humans.
Right.
Or he wouldn't be recognizable as human anymore. So
right. Exactly. So that puts it a little closer. And there's also an interview, I believe, somewhere where Wolfe mentions that it may be closer than we think. And I forget the details of that. I wish I was more prepared for that right now, but maybe I can pull it up for next time. But there is one where, he talks about how he doesn't necessarily think of it as millions of years in the future. But then there's another interview where he does. So yeah, it's a hard tell. Personally, I like to think of it as truly millennia into the future, just because that gives that sense of distance. And I always think of the one image where they look at the archaeological site and the digging when there's just layer upon layer upon layer upon layer of civilization. And that to me seems so much more compatible with, however far into the future.
Well, the idea is at least that this is the time when mankind has basically used up everything on Earth. I think Wolfe described it as the time when you have a family that was rich and now they've gone through all the money and they're in a big house with a lot of empty rooms and they've sold off the furniture and they're very poor, but the remnants of their wealth are still there.
Yeah. The other thing that would be fun to work out, and I'm certainly not going to do it now, but I know that would interest you, is if we could figure out which constellations are still mentioned and are still present. And it would depend on knowing how detailed Wolfe got into figuring out how constellations would move over time. But that would, if we're assuming he worked out the details that well, then, if we ever got a solid sort of navigational point, then maybe we could figure it out.
But even then, the constellations do move if they're assuming they're recognizable, but they come back to their places eventually. So
that's true.
You can have, multiple iterations of that. So even that doesn't necessarily prove anything.
Unless we're so many millions of years in the future that all the stars are actually in different places.
Scattered. Yes. All right. Well, Mike Benowitz had a really interesting conversation about Triskela.
Yeah, a great post and great conversation that started. But one thing he mentioned about why he likes it so much is the chapter. Well, it is like we had said, it feels a bit like the one-off episode with the dog. Of course, it does have all kinds of connections to the rest of the book too. But the one thing that he mentioned was how it's really showing Severian's first show of mercy, which is a nice connection, or at least contrast to where, he kills a man in the first chapter. And this is the first one where he saves someone. And it's the first step in his redemption, I guess you could say. To me, what I really like about that point is that all of his worry that we talked about, where he's really worried, or I felt like he's really worried about being responsible for the first time, just throws that into more sharp relief. That it's another way to really say that he's really kind of coming to terms with, hey, this is a different way for me to act, and a different way to act than I've been raised to do.
Right.
So, yeah, I think that's absolutely an important point to bring up about why the dog is here. It's not just that it's not just a cute little boy and his dog story, but it really is the first time that he resurrects someone else or something else, and that he realizes he can heal as well as harm.
He also had an interesting comment about the Autarch's face on the coin. And his argument is that Essentially, when he received the coin, he assumed that he was being entered into the army of Vodalus. And little did he know that he received this coin, but it was actually a symbol of being entered into the army of the Autarch, which he would eventually be the Autarch. And so when he looks at it, that's the realization that the meaning of this symbol is not the meaning he thought it was. It was not the face of Vodalus, which I think is another really great reading of that last line.
There's another point he makes too about how there are things in chapter 4 that are all about Severian getting things both right and wrong at the same time in wonderful ways. And I won't explain them all right now, but it's a great post with lots of stuff going on. So I would definitely encourage you to take a look at that one and comment on it. Wits always has some good stuff.
Oh, do we want to wait? What about the emails? We got actually an email.
Oh, that's right.
So Michael Mantis, Andre Drisi also wrote in on the email.
Rereading Wolfe at gmail.com, just by the way.
Thanks.
Since I think we've forgotten to say that in a couple episodes.
Yeah, well, it's on the question of all our torturers. He brings up a really interesting list of analogies. He brings them down: the quarry, the hunter, client, torturer, consumer, merchant, enemy, soldier, subject, ruler, men, women. And he points out that all of them are ending with "to love is to destroy." So the disjoint, he says, is not between quarry and hunter and client and torturer. All of those, of course, destroy, but men who are destroyed by women. And that is the one that is problematic and hard to rectify. But, I was actually thinking about this one, that in Christian theology, destroy is a more ambiguous term. It means in order for there to be rebirth, there has to be destruction. As Jesus said, that if a seed doesn't die, then it doesn't become a plant, it doesn't grow. And that's very much like the way it is for Earth and the new sun. And the concept could be that the men, in order to become something better, that love for a woman can destroy a child, in the bad sense of childishness, and to create a man, so that it might actually make sense to some sense to group that with the others.
Mm-hmm. And the one thing he pointed out too is that where destroy, when he says that line there with the comparison, is that all love that which they destroy, is that it's not necessarily thinking in terms of one thing deliberately destroying another person, like a soldier destroying the enemy, but rather the destroy might mean more like being a parasite. So that something is connected to and draining on the other thing, and then it might work backwards that way than the way that we read them. I don't know if I'm explaining this very well. He had a really articulate way to put it, but the idea is that in each of those lists, what Wolfe was really doing is saying you would expect, for example, that the torturer destroys the client but actually loves them. But instead, it might be that the torturer is somehow parasitic on the client, and that the torturer survives because they need the client. And it's not that they're actively destroying them, but in fact that their need for them is just as destructive as something else. So a ruler needs his subjects, a soldier needs his enemies, the merchants need their consumers. There's the potential there that the love and the need can damage both of them pretty heavily. That's a much more sophisticated way to look at it, but I liked it. I liked it a lot.
Michael's got a new book coming out.
He does.
Yeah.
Does indeed.
It's I think it's due out November 11th, and it's the Gene Wolfe's The Book of the New Sun, a chapter guide. And
a chapter guide. How funny, how familiar.
What a clever idea.
But yeah, which honestly I did not know, and I don't think has been really well advertised, but you're starting to, I know it's been posted now on Facebook and in the Reddit groups. So another companion book for New Sun by the Lexicon Earthis man, which is not a bad thing, and something that I'm sure a lot of folk want to grab.
I need something else on that shelf, so I got empty space right here.
And we should note too that there's going to be a giveaway for an electronic version, I believe,
a Kindle version,
a Kindle version on Goodreads, and the information to that is on the Facebook site. And I know someone has posted that on Reddit, I believe. Was it you?
Yep.
It might have been you.
That was me.
That was you. But yeah, so if you're interested in that, take a look online, and you can even just search him on Goodreads. And I'm sure it's going to start on October 5th, I believe, and go for a couple days.
Oh, for a full week until
for a full week. Okay,
until
good.
the 13th, Sunday the 13th.
Oh, good. So more information there on how you can get a free electronic Kindle version. We had hoped at one point to be able to comment on everything that everybody offered, but actually this week we had too much. And the chapter is already long enough, so unless we're going to give you like a 3-hour episode, we probably need to go ahead and get to the chapter itself.
Yeah.
But please keep writing, and we're going to try and work as much in as we can.
And even if we don't get it in the next episode, that doesn't mean that I'm not working it into subsequent episodes when we're talking about the chapters. They always come back, and these things stick in my head. I think of them for a good long time before I come to a final, something that I can say about it.
Well, good. Well, shall we get into the chapter?
Yeah, let's go check out some paintings.
Chapter 5, The Picture Cleaner and Others.
Looking forward to this one.
This is a fun one.
Yeah, I think for most people, this seems to be the moment when they learned how to read Wolfe.
I think so.
When they learned what a Wolfe story demanded. Here's where we have the painting of the warrior in the wasteland. That seems to be for most people what for me reading the Fifth Head of Cerberus was, and maybe for you, what the recognition that the towers were spaceships was.
Yeah, this one and then Alton, I think, are the ones that people sort of look back on. Probably Alton a little more nostalgically. Like, I think the library, just for bookish people, anytime you get a fantastic library, you're going to be excited about it. But this one still has a couple things in it that I think, capture some sentimentality about the chapter or about the book.
Well, I think really, this and the next chapter are almost one chapter, really. I guess Wolfe thought it needed breaking up, but it's essentially the same setting, the same story. And if you were to take this as a chapter and someone were to compile, the top 5 favorite chapters in the book, this would surely make every list.
I would think so. Yeah. And the one thing too, speaking of it being chapters, I mean, it ends sort of, in the middle of a scene. So where you're like, somebody says, "Who's there?"
Right. Exactly.
I forget the exact words, but yeah. Good. Well, let's jump right into the details.
Okay. The chapter starts with the Feast of Holy St. Catherine. It's the most sacred day of the Torturers Guild. We don't go into detail of the feast. That's going to come later. Severian only explains that it's the day that an apprentice becomes a journeyman, and that a journeyman who very occasionally gets elevated to master does so.
And one thing we could say too is that apparently all the guilds have a feast day like this.
Exactly.
And I assume that for most of them, that's when people change ranks or things like that. But it's basically the holiday for each guild.
Oh, or marries a female bear.
Right. Right. Exactly.
And Severian's friends Raucho and Raucho are elevated. Severian is the next oldest of the apprentices by some significant margin, so he becomes the captain of the apprentices. The ceremony involves the masters slow walking into the room and the journeymen hoisting the 2 new journeymen, Raucho and Raucho, on their shoulders. And they carry them outside and shoot off fireworks.
And by the way, I think one thing I think is fun about the fireworks is I wondered, like, if they do that on every feast day, does that mean that their fireworks are going off all over the place for every guild on every day? Well, like every day or something like that, depending on how many guilds there are.
Yeah, well, we know of at least, a half dozen. So, but when they shoot the fireworks, then at that point, the guards in the Great Keep fire all their weaponry in an annual gesture of enmity, quote unquote.
Yeah, and we've learned before that the very top of the tower has a gun in it, right? Like he talks about.
Yeah, but I think that these are coming from the Great Keep. So
oh, that's right.
So this is these are the guards up at the Great Keep. So we get a mention here that the masters wear gold traced masks,
and I think that's the most detail apart from Gerlos's eyepiece that we've heard about the masks, right? Up to this point, we've only known that they were, or we assume they're Fechin as well.
None of the artwork, I think, has them having Fechin black masks. They only say that they're masks.
I guess you're right. Yeah, I always assumed it was the same color, but whenever he mentions Fechin, it's always the cloak.
Right. And I always just assume, leather masks with little square
Oh,
eye
really?
holes.
Oh, okay. I had always assumed they were black. That's interesting. Okay. I'll be on the lookout for that to
Yeah.
see if they do talk about that.
So for Severian, it slowly starts to dawn on him all the responsibility that will immediately fall on his shoulders.
And I think it's funny how slow, like he specifically mentions, I hadn't quite realized how much stuff I was going to have to take on, which seems on the one hand seems a little naive, like, you're going to be the boss. But I think it also points to maybe intentionally Severian insisting, I was still a kid. Like I was still
Yeah.
really naive. The fact that he doesn't realize he's about to be a boss and what that actually means.
Yeah, you
And
would think that they would have some kind of handoff between him and Drott, where it
right,
says, okay, you have to do this and you have to do that.
right, with all the detail and the things that he's suddenly responsible for. But yeah,
But he's not really, he's had to do all these things. Now he's just responsible for forcing everyone to do them.
correct.
I was sitting in the ruined chapel, enjoying the pageantry, and only just conscious, in the same pleasant way I was anticipating the feast, that I would be senior to all the rest when the last of it was done. By slow degrees, however, a feeling of disquiet seized me. I was miserable before I knew I was no longer happy, and bowed with responsibility that I did not yet fully understand I held it.
Yeah, I like that line. I was miserable before I was no longer happy, and bowed with responsibility when I didn't fully yet understand I held it. One thing about those lines that gets me is that there's an analogy there to how that symbol phrase works, that I was miserable before I was no longer happy, that he doesn't quite realize what he's becoming, but he already is that thing. And I know it's a tiny little thing. It's a bit of a stretch to say that this is exactly the same logic as the symbols make us. But there's an echo of that there.
Yeah, yeah. And it's a sense of, emotion precedes reason.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
He then says that he mentions how much Drott had to go through. He says, I remembered how much difficulty Drott had encountered in keeping us in order and that I would have to do it now. Mm-hmm. And that he remembers then he had been a second or that Raucho had been his lieutenant. And even though he was kind of with them all the time, he didn't have anyone his own age to do it.
Right. He's like, Jorda had someone his own age to be his second, his lieutenant. And
right. So his solution that he comes up with here is pretty aggressive, but it's something that I feel like this is put in here intentionally to show us a little bit about what life was actually like in the Matachin Tower, mm-hmm. that it's a violent place. I mean, it's not only violent with what they're doing, but even with those sort of scenes of professionalism that they showed before, the way that authority is established among the kids is just by brutality.
Yeah.
The way he describes it is when they have to go change their clothes and get ready to start serving dinner, he throws a cot up against the door, basically traps all the little kids in there, takes Iata and slams his head violently. How many times? Half a dozen times?
Half a dozen times, yeah.
Against the wall, and then says, all right, you be my second. And he agrees. And then they just go grab the next couple.
He can't talk. He just nods.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. And it's brutal.
Right.
On the one hand, it shows quick thinking, right? He all of a sudden he realizes he has to do something. I suppose you could say, yeah, that's quick thinking. At the same time, it shows that his immediate recourse is just a violent.
Yeah, but he's the captain. Everyone knows he's going to be captain because he's the oldest by far. He has that title and he has that responsibility, but he doesn't get elected to it. Mm-hmm. So he's expected to seize that role and to force the other apprentices to recognize him. He'll maintain his position to some degree by brutality. And in doing so, he'll signal comfortingly, I think, that someone is in charge. It's kind of a very insightful understanding, I think, about the necessity of the dark side of a certain kind of leadership.
It could be. And this is the first time we see Severian in a leadership role. We know he's going to become Autarch. So what we're getting here is early in the book, kind of like either a preview of what kind of role he's actually going to have as a leader, or potentially something that he's going to look back on and try a different way to be a leader later on.
Exactly.
I think. So we'll see. And you mentioned it. I'm not sure about the comforting part.
Well, if you've ever been on a team of people, I have, where it's painfully obvious that no one is really in charge.
Right.
No, it's very unsettling.
And he says it was effective. He does say that, there was no mass rebellion after that.
Yeah.
Only individual malingering.
Which implies that mass rebellions had happened.
Right.
But how does he do it? He says, in a space of 100 breaths, the boys had been kicked into submission.
Yeah. And it also shows that one thing Severian is good at is he decides on something and he immediately takes action and does it. Mm-hmm. And there are times in here where Severian is vacillating a little bit, but I think that for the most part, he usually makes decisions and sticks with them, even if they're ultimately wrong. One of the things about his character is that he is very decisive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sometimes when he should stop and consider, he goes forward.
Right. From a bigger perspective, the point here about the need for violence and the need for, in this case, we could call it brutality, but honestly, I think it's a bigger issue in that Wolfe is dealing with is what is the role of violence in leadership? And that's important to the book because, as we know, part of the thing that Severian's going to have to do when he goes through this test is he learns that the Earth is going to have to suffer in order to get the new sun.
Right.
And that's actually, especially in Earth of the New Sun, that's a huge thematic issue. In Earth of the New Sun, it seems to me that one of the reasons why I feel like he does pass the test is that he's someone who they figure has all the good qualities of the person, but he's also willing to make that sacrifice of being totally brutal to drown the Earth, kill all the people that are going to be killed in the flood. But then he knows that in the long run, it's going to be for something better. And I think there's a big part of Earth of the New Sun that says that that's actually strength, that it's not brutality, but it's strength to evolve, strength to grow, strength to change. On a big sense, that seems really important to Wolfe. Like, I feel like he actually does. I don't know that he's actually showing this in order to tell you, hey, Severian's a brutal, awful guy. Like, I think you're right. I think that Wolfe definitely, even if this is done, by a kid and shows us, slamming his head multiple times, which might be going a little too far.
Well, if he kills him or he causes a hemorrhage, then it's probably going to be considered to have been a bad. And that would be hard for him to recover from as a leader as well.
Yeah,
he has to exert his will but not cause serious damage. Yeah, everyone has to feel like what the exertion of his will is for everyone's good. You can't do that if you've killed somebody.
Right. And I think I spend so much time on this because I actually feel like this is something that may turn people off of Wolfe, I think. And honestly, that this is an issue where I think Wolfe isn't just straight out coming up and saying, yes, this is exactly how every leader should act. But at the same time, there's a core of truth here that he's going to show is really necessary in a lot of other places, not just in this book. And that's an attitude that I know people will be turned off by. But I think it's also one we need to be careful of. At least I feel like we need to be careful of saying, yeah, that's just how Wolfe feels. Because I think he does recognize that it can also backfire.
Sure.
And the fact that he's also, so far, just on this one page, mentioned a few things that to me, Mark Severian is really naive and not quite realizing what he has to go through is saying, he did make a quick decision. He decided to do something. Maybe there are better ways to do it, even if he had a good intuition.
Well, the thing to remember is that he's not going, by the end of this book, he is not going to be a congressman. He's going to be an autarch. He's going to be a single person tyrant. And that involves, bringing a lot of people in line who don't want to be in line, and with force and with violence. And it is true that all government to some extent is kept afloat by violence. And also, he's probably thinking of his time in the military, in which you also keep men in line in order to save their lives, but also to get them to do something that has a very good chance of getting them killed.
Yeah, this is totally academic geekdom, but you may know, I don't know if you do know, there's a philosopher theorist named Carl Schmitt.
He was the Nazi.
Right. But
he wrote a critique on democracy.
Right. The big idea that he had that became really sort of popular to talk about and criticize in literary criticism circles for a while was about when you have a crisis or an emergency, and what's the role of leadership in an emergency or a crisis. And the point there is that even democracies will always have moments where you need some leader to step in and basically do what has to be done, regardless of the populace's feeling. And the point of it is basically democracy even depends on tyrants at moments of crisis and moments of emergency. What's the term for it? Exception. That's what it is. It's the exception. He says that, governments are always, even democratic governments are founded on moments of exception, and they can't function without those.
But he abandoned the exception.
Yeah. So anyway, that's totally a side issue, but it's one thing I was thinking about here. Schmidt was like super popular back when I was early in grad school. So
really?
Popular as
something to talk about.
As something to talk about, and not to sort of champion. And I mean, lots of people hated him, but it was one of the useful tools to really look at sort of political ideology and all kinds of things. So yeah, anyway.
So at this point, we get a bit of a repeat of the summary that Severian gave previously of a torture's life. As a captain, he gets new duties and far more freedom. He's in charge of directing the apprentices and preparing meals for the journeymen and clients. He delivers messages to distant parts of the Citadel. He takes part in the guild's business in small ways. He gets to see things in the Citadel that he never got to see before. Interesting things I noticed: granaries with demonic cats. Views of really dreadful slums.
Gangrenous slums.
Yeah. And a new word, Pinko-Thekin.
I'll try it. Pinaka-Thekin.
Pinaka-Thekin.
And that one I looked up, and the reason I looked it up was because I kept saying pink in my head, and I'm like, it's not pink.
Well, it's like a bibliotheca.
Exactly.
Pinaka-Thekin. Pinaka-Thekin. Yeah.
If I'm reading the pronunciation guide correctly, it's Pinaka-Thekin. That is actually a messed up version of both Greek and a Latin word. The English word is a corruption of two similar Latin and Greek words.
Oh, so it basically means a picture gallery, right?
Yeah. And usually a hallway. So like a long hallway. In fact, so there's actually part of the Acropolis in Athens has the name, the Pinacotheca.
Oh.
And it's where a lot of the art was shown, but it's the name of the hall is actually the Pinacotheca as a proper noun. And so here, though, we've got the Pinacothecan, which I assume the way he's using it is plural.
That's what I thought. Yeah. But that you have multiple galleries that are under a single brick roof with windows in it.
Right. And so the one thing that if you look up various Pinacothecan in museums, they're almost all long hallways. So not like rooms, but actually one long hallway that goes down, which is a perfect visual image. Mm-hmm. One thing, I may jump ahead just a little bit, but he says that he had been walking down one of these for at least a league, which if we're taking the regular meaning of a league correctly is about 3 miles. So that's one thing where I think the scale of the Citadel becomes important. Mm-hmm. How big is this place? And does he literally mean a league, or is he just exaggerating or talking about what it felt like?
I think that the picture that he gives is that it's not only is it very big enough that a normal person never sees all of it, but that it's incredibly dense and complicated. So that in order to traverse it, he says that you need hundreds of landmarks just to figure out where you're going for the places that you know about, not including the ones that you've never been to. And also when he's talking to Rudesind at this point, he mentions, Rudesind says, "Oh yeah, I know where that is. It's over behind the witch's keep, right?" And and he's a little surprised to find out that the witch's keep, at least, is more of an iconic landmark than his guild, the Madison Tower.
And to jump ahead a few chapters, we also know that once he gets outside the wall of the Citadel, immediately outside, even when he's still within viewing distance of this place, people are all like, the tortures are real. I thought you were a legend. So, right. So it's another moment where I think Wolfe's playing with our sense of scale here in order to suggest that it's, like you said, labyrinthine, but also huge, but also just really large, so that no one is really familiar with everything.
Right. So the floor is flagstone with rugs. Like you said, it's a long hallway with arched doorways into rooms that are filled with pictures. The hall is also covered with pictures. Many are so old and sooty that he can't make them out.
When he says smoke grimed or sooty like that, did you take that to be from like torches?
What else could it be? Because one of these pictures, this is his third time cleaning it in his lifetime.
Right.
So it's gotten sooty enough that he needed to clean it 3 times in however old he is, 90, 100, who knows. And then he describes some pictures. Now, the first one, I've tried to imagine what this is that he's looking at, and I've never been able to. A dancer whose wings seemed like leeches. That's the first, that one. Now the next one I can kind of guess. I always assumed because of the other famous picture that these must be real things, but even though I can kind of imagine what this next one is, haven't really been able to place it. A silent looking woman who gripped a double-bladed dagger wearing a mortuary mask.
Which is another moment that seems totally goth.
So very
sort of 80s goth
yeah.
kind of thing. But yeah, I searched through the Earth list and read it again to see if anyone had been able to place the other paintings. And to my knowledge, I can't find anyone who's even really given a good guess. And it's obvious from what we know of the main painting, we're going to see that Severian could very well and probably is misidentifying things. Like, are those actually leeches, or is there something else that just looks like it? And so I was trying to think of other things, especially that double-bladed dagger. I was trying to think of anything else in sort of iconic photography, maybe of the 80s, or of anything at all that would look like someone in a mask holding something that would look like a two-sided dagger. I couldn't think of anything, even like advertisements. I was just wondering if that was a joke, like if there was something going on, but I'm really not sure. So that's one place where if someone listening does have an idea of what those two are, that would be amazing for me.
Oh, that'd be great.
I would love to know those.
Next, he comes to a picture cleaner, Rudesind. Severian wants to ask for direction, but the guy is very absorbed in his work. But before we talk about him and the picture he's cleaning, let's talk about the 2 armatures that Severian encounters. Their water cooler talking about Vodalis and some daring theft he and his crew got away with. Maybe it was the raid on the necropolis.
Yeah, I was wondering, do you think he is mentioning that? He says Vodalis had what he'd come for, you see. And the only reason I kind of think he's probably talking about someone else was that the people they were fighting there were more like they weren't the actual guard. They were just townsfolk, right? They were just people from the Citadel.
But he's hearing it secondhand, and so who knows?
Oh, yeah. And the only reason I thought that is thinking about the classes in the world. The armatures are supposed to be the warrior class. Mm-hmm. Is that right? So I would normally be thinking he's talking about something that maybe the other warrior class had been involved in. But I don't know. It probably doesn't matter, in the long run. So we do get Vodalis, and of course that's going to make Severian's ears prick up.
Yeah, we get some more local color about the way torturers are viewed in the Citadel. They stop Severian and basically bully him officiously. One of them is named Raucho, and he demands, "What are you doing here?" And Severian says he's delivering a message to Master Ulton. He was just about to ask where he was, and Raucho says that, if you don't know, where Moulton is, then you don't really have any business delivering a message to him. He tells Severian to give him the message, and then he'll give it to a page to deliver. But Severian says delivering it is his job. Then the other guy steps in and he says, "Don't you know where this kid is from?" And he relates that Severian is from the Mansion Tower. And Raucho's face tightens when he hears that. And the other armature gives him directions, but he tells him to wait until they've left because they don't want to look at him in front of them while they're walking. And Raucho says, he'd prefer that he had him in view instead of walking behind them. But Severian lets him go. Yeah.
So the only question I have about this part is how he knows that Severian is an apprentice, because he's not supposed to be wearing the Fulgen cloak or a mask.
Not wearing that
at this point.
He can't be.
He's still an apprentice. The only reason I ask that and wonder if he recognizes him from something else is just because Raucho shows up again. Raucho is the one that he races against with Agia, which is a totally out of left field coincidence that of all the people in this place, we were just talking about how vast it is, that he happens to interact with one of these 2 random people one more time.
Right.
Just another moment where I'm like, okay, it seems like that is too coincidental. But again, it's when I couldn't put together what that would mean. But then when I was reading it this time and noticed that he seems to know he's an apprentice without any outward symbol, it just made me wonder, it's kind of like my thing with the guy with the key in the very beginning. It's like, is something going on here? It's just an itch, but I have no even real sense of what it would mean.
Well, yeah, it doesn't say how he knows where he's from, but it's not Raucho that recognizes him.
You're right.
It's his friend. And Wolfe had a defense of his story, of some aspect in his story where he said that basically you have to have him do some things once you know it's possible, or else it doesn't make sense in the story. In this case, you have a guy who bullied him, and then later he gets to, get some comeuppance.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So they realize he's a torturer. One of them knows the torture, apparently knows what torturers look like. The other one doesn't. But then they give him some directions and then send him on his way. But I think it's funny because they're like, no, let us go first. So
we don't want to look at you.
Look at you while we walk. Again, a moment where before we've only seen the common people react to torturers. Now we see even the higher classes. I mean, they're obviously not afraid of Severian, but they don't want to be reminded of the guild.
Right. So now we come to the picture cleaner, Rudesind, the curator, as we'll find.
Do you want to talk about the picture before the character, or do the character before the picture?
Let's just say he hails Severian from the top of the ladder, and Severian seems to have forgotten that he was there. The text says, the picture he was cleaning showed an armored figure standing in a desolate landscape. It had no weapon, but held a staff bearing a strange, stiff banner. The visor of this figure's helmet was entirely of gold, without eye slits or ventilation. In its polished surface, the deadly desert could be seen in reflection, and nothing more. The warrior of a dead world affected me deeply, though. I could not say why, or even just what emotion it was I felt. In some obscure way, I wanted to take down the picture and carry it. But not to our necropolis, but into some of those mountain forests in which our necropolis was, as I understood even then, an idealized but vitiated image. It should have stood among trees, the edge of its frame resting on young grass. You want to talk about this now?
Let's go ahead and talk about it, because this is, I think, more than Rudesind, this is really the center of the chapter that grabs people's attention. So when you first get the description, it's not always clear. And I still have a vivid image in my mind of what I imagined, because it struck me so much. Also because of something else I was reading at the time. Actually, Spencer's Fairy Queen, which is actually, I think, is connected here in some way or another, whether intentionally or not. Whole different issue. But I remember I had an image of a knight in gold holding a huge spear with like a starched banner on it. And when I first read that description, it didn't click to me what it was supposed to be at all. I think as soon as he said warrior, my mind was off in its own way. But I still really remember an image of a golden knight. Yeah, I just have that vivid image in my mind. Now, when you first heard the description, did it click for you?
I don't have any memory of any image I had before the direct reveal, which leads me to always kind of remember it as if I recognized it immediately, what he was talking about. It was an old picture of a guy on the moon.
Gotcha.
But what I did not pick up on, and I didn't pick up on even when I finished the chapter, was the way Wolfe subtly signaled in Severian a knowledge of something that he couldn't know, but he picks up from just the air. And that is that this is a picture of the moon, because he says it belongs in a forest, which is to say, it's a picture of the moon, because that's the moon as he knows it.
Yeah. And I think it's a subtle point that you're exactly right. I never noticed it until this time, that he immediately says, I thought it should have belonged on the moon. And assuming he's telling the truth and not making himself sound, like he was super, super smart. But I think the way he describes it isn't saying, oh yeah, I secretly knew it was the moon. It seems more like he's saying, I had this weird sense that it belonged in this way. And he even says something, it affected me deeply, but I couldn't really say why. But you're right. He has some, and I don't know if it's intuitive or if there's more of a sort of plot-based explanation that other things in the story might explain about how he understood that.
I think this is a favorite literary device of Wolfe. You'll see it come up in a lot of his stories. Unfortunately, often he doesn't have Rudesind just flatly explain what it is, and
Right.
you're expected to just figure it out on your own, and maybe put two and two together, maybe put a little cognitive leap in there, and
Yeah.
and figure out what it is he's talking. But it's a hint that something's there.
Yeah. Certainly, the further along he got, the the less not just willing he was to explain it. I mean, in his later books,
Right,
I mean, it's
exactly.
not even sometimes clear in his later books. Like this is sort of this. He slows down. He describes it. You know, you're supposed to be paying attention. In later books, you don't even know you're supposed to be paying attention. But yeah, so this is an image of an astronaut on the moon. One thing that's kind of cool is I've never seen an exact picture that describes this.
Yeah, I think it's kind of an idealized, but it's supposed to be a painting, right? It's not supposed to be a photograph.
That's what I was wondering, because he calls it a picture.
Right.
He only ever calls it a picture.
Right.
And yeah, I don't know. Like once he says it's the moon, I'm like, oh yeah, it's a photograph. But I don't know. He never clarified. When I was reading this time, I was trying to see, does Rudesind ever talk about, a painting or painting versus a photograph, or do they make a distinction, just because he calls it a picture? I don't know. There are, by the way, tons of people who have tried to find pictures from Apollo 11 and some other images that would fit. There's one image of Apollo 11 that would fit if this was just a photograph, except that it's black and white.
Yeah.
And it was never taken in color. So that's one thing where, again, now was Wolfe going from memory here, or did he have, if he had a specific picture in mind, was he even remembering it correctly? Who knows?
Well, there's a Time Life book I had as a child called We Came in Peace. And I always imagined that cover of that, which I think is actually a painting though.
No, I remember searching for this image, like trying to find, it'd just be fun to find exactly the picture that he's talking about. And that's, I think, what made me wonder, is this a painting? Is this a recreation? There's another painting I know that, or another photo that I always thought was the right one, but the Earth isn't in the background. So
that's another problem. But you have that there. That's a great thing. You have the banner, you have the stiff banner, you have the gold visor, you have the Earth up in the sky, over his shoulder.
Right.
So, once you have enough actually to put it together if you knew that it was a real thing. And but he's going to explain what it is. So then you can say, oh yeah, look, there's all the pieces there.
Yeah. And when we get the identification, we also learn a lot more about the world, because the way he explains to Severian what he's looking at is he says, oh yeah, that's the moon, but it's before all this other stuff happened.
Exactly.
Right. So we find out, okay, there are now forests on the moon, just like we described, that's why he had that intuition that it belongs there. He also mentions that the moon is closer now.
Yes. Right.
Which makes all kinds of questions about why, or what kind of technology they had. Like, was it intentional? Was it pulled towards the Earth?
Well, I got to wonder if that's a mistake on Wolfe's part. If you assume that, okay, over time, the moon is going to slow down. Oh, so it's going to move closer and closer to Earth. But that's actually not what happens. As the moon slows down, the orbit gets wider. The moon moves farther and farther away from Earth.
Oh, so you think that some people, I guess, may have said that, yeah, over time it slows, and so it's just a natural thing that's happened, however thousands and thousands.
Potentially. I mean, you could also assume something that someone said, well, it'd be nice if the moon were closer. And so they moved it closer and sped it up. But they would literally have to speed up its orbit to keep it from falling into the Earth.
I think it's one of the other podcasts had mentioned that maybe the moon was intentionally pulled closer because as the sun cools, maybe there was more ice, which means less water, or more ice at the poles, which means less water, which now you can pull the tides closer with the moon. I don't know. I mean, that could be. Yeah, I don't know. That's just one difference about the moon that I never, like, why was it closer? But when you talked about the possible, decaying orbit or something.
Right. But it would have to be, but in order for it to decay closer to us, when you think about what an orbit is, basically what happens is it moves fast enough so that as it falls, it can't fall onto the planet. It misses the planet, continually missing the planet. So if you slow down, then you can expand your orbit farther away. It takes longer for the falling object to actually, land. So if you have a wider orbit, then you can have a slower speed. If you have a closer orbit, you must have a much faster speed.
You would think an engineer would know that, but who knows?
Well, yeah. I mean, it's intuitive, but it's not.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's not actually the way it works.
Different kind of engineering
Exactly.
from Pringles
Yeah,
cans.
exactly. He didn't. That was never a problem he had to come up with. So we're so far enough in the future at this point that the moon has not only been given an atmosphere of some kind and forested, but that the moon landing itself is a metaphor for the origin of mankind. As we would say, since mankind sat around the first fire, they say, since man first landed on the moon. On the Samru, in the Samu chapter of the Citadel Autarch, Severian records, every long story, if it be told truly, will be found to contain all the elements that have contributed to human drama since the first rude ship reached the strand of Loon. Not only noble deeds and tender emotion, but grotesquerie, bathos, and so on. So it's this is like, for Severian's time, the time when mankind became humankind and not, something else.
I like that. I like that quite a bit, because this is an art gallery, not a history gallery.
Exactly.
Right. And so art is going to be telling that kind of more mythic story. That's good.
Severian kind of describes Rudesind. He says he had a weak glance, reminding me of the turtles we sometimes frightened on the banks of the Gyul, and a nose and chin that nearly met. So he's toothless, right?
Mm-hmm.
The government that he's working for doesn't have a top-rate health insurance package. Rudesind says, so you're a torturer. Do you know I've never seen your place? And Severian says, well, I hope you never do. And Rudesind says he's not worried because he's so old now that if they were to start to torture him, he'd just immediately die. My heart would stop like that. And he dropped his sponge into his bucket and attempted to snap his wet fingers, though no sound came. Rudesind, who is pretty old, reveals he knows where the Mansion Tower is because it's behind the Witch's Keep. It surprises Severian that the Witch's Keep is more of a landmark than his tower. Rudesind explains that people don't talk about it much. It's an unpleasant concept and people don't want to think about it. Then Rudesind explains that the two bullying armigers ought to be more like exultants, but they can't because they're afraid to go to war. I assume that they're not physically like exultants, but there is some level of class that they could ascend to if they were to brave combat, but they are cowards.
Which is odd too, because the armigers are supposed to be a warrior class, I thought. And does Wolfe come right out and say that in his afterword?
Well, the name implies that.
He actually points out the oddity here in the appendix to Claw. He says their name indicates a fighting class, but they don't appear to have monopolized the major roles in the army. And he also said that Valeria is of this class. He mentions that there. But yeah, so almost more like ceremonial types of fighters than the guys doing either the fighting or the officering, I guess.
But it's still risky enough that they don't want to be there.
Mm-hmm. So before Rudesind talks to him, he talks about what it was like to watch him. He says, like one of those half spiritual friends who in dreams address us from the clouds. The old man said, so you're a torturer. It's just an odd thing where he's saying, where he's mixing up dreams and reality a little bit. And of course, we know that we get dreams from Severian all over the place, but the way he introduces this guy is he coming from a dream? And I know we're going to get into it, but I think that's one of the first clues in the text that make people start to really wonder about who this guy is.
Yeah, exactly.
Plus, we also do know that things that Severian, people that he takes to be dreams, like Malrubius, are not just dreams, but are actually the Equasters or the projections.
Or at some point, or maybe they are dreams. It's hard to say for sure. But as we talked about from chapter 2, where he does see Malrubius, maybe it wasn't a dream. Maybe it wasn't just his dying brain. Maybe it was a memory. So Severian, talking about the armigers, he says, they should be done away with. Voldalus would set them quarrying. He put them to work in mines. They're a carryover from some past age. What possible help can they give the world? And Rudesind said, what help was they when to begin? Do you know? Severian says he doesn't know. What do you think he means by that? What is that?
Rudesind's
Yeah.
point? I felt like that was more banter, like Severian saying, man, those guys have outlived their usefulness. And he's like, were they ever useful?
Yeah. Or like in
Just
the past age, maybe they didn't really have a really help. They weren't really any good back then either.
Yeah. It could also say something about the armigers in general, or about how war is fought, or by whom in the society. One thing I want to go back to too is the point that Severian says that he was surprised that the Witch's Tower was more well known than the Magician Tower. That's a moment that I think you could possibly accuse Severian of being very self-centered, but it also seems more to me like Severian in the narrative is again legitimately pointing out, I was a naive kid.
Right. I thought
point,
that,
and I really
if you've grown up in a small town, you have a inflated idea about how central your little town is and how well known it is. And I grew up in a little town of maybe 10,000 at the most at its highest. And they had a busy road that ran along the lake. And to me, it was, a scary road. It was the highway essentially going through my town. And, you go back and you discover, well, the speed limit on this road is 30 miles an hour. It's basically 4 lanes, 2 lanes going either way. Yeah. He's a kid. He's finding out that the world is a lot bigger than he ever imagined. Even his town.
Oh, his town. Yeah. Even his town, which seems so vast and may well be, but it's a part of an even larger place. What's fun too is then right after that, that's when, or right after that line about the towers, that's when Rudesind says, yeah, don't be too hard on the armigers. He's like, if you kind of understand what all they're going through, it's a different perspective. So it's kind of a real quick little moment there about being, naive and to sort of have a much broader, more subtle understanding.
So when Severian says that about how Volus would put them in the mines, their carryover past age, and they have that, then Rudesind, it says, Rudesind scrambled down from the ladder like an aged monkey, seeming all arms and legs, wrinkled neck. His hands were as long as my feet, the crooked fingers laced with blue veins. Is Rudesind an exultant?
One thing we know about the exultants is that they're not just tall, but they're also lanky, right? And he talks about how, long his hands are. And that's one thing that, definitely stands out. When we meet Ultan in the next chapter, he just comes right out and says that Ultan's an exultant. Right. That's, so here, I don't know. And when he says monkey, it could mean he's kind of hunched over, could be part of it. But it's that line, seeming all arms and legs. That's the thing that to me makes me think lanky and really long. And
well, it's those hands they're big, large, giant, very large hands.
Which would be interesting if a lot of the curators are exultants. If you're thinking about sort of a guild system, medieval class society, that someone who's an exultant wouldn't seem to need to belong to a guild because they're the aristocrats.
Right.
But we know that in Ultan's case, that the way people get into the guild is kind of random, or maybe random. But I don't know. I'm not really sure. Do you have an idea? Do you have a feeling about whether he's
I have no idea. It's an interesting, I just think it's an interesting description of him.
I guess another thing that, to jump way ahead, that Rudesind shows up a couple more times.
He shows up at the House Absolute, right? Cleaning pictures.
Yep. And there's all kinds of theories about his relationship to other artists. And I suppose, especially with some of the speculation that goes on with, was he related to Fechin in some way? Some people think that he was Fechin. We'll talk about that in a second. But that might be another case where if you do connect some dots, that he might well be an exultant because of his connection to other things in the highest echelons of the classes.
Yeah. So he climbs down from the ladder and he introduces himself to Severian. Severian explains that he's never been to this part of the Citadel before, and Rudesind says that it's the best part of the Citadel, and I think he might be right. He says, we have a Fechin here that shows 3 girls dressing another one with flowers so real you expect the bees to come out of it. And when I originally thought that he must be talking about the Russian painter, Nikolai Fechin, but I never could find a reference to this. And Fechin is a saint's name. So, it could be someone closer to their age, their time period.
And as far as that's another painting that I three girls dressing one another with flowers. Hard to know exactly what that is. Seems like it. I was trying to think of like art history periods. It could be Rococo. Seems more like maybe some sort of pre-Raphaelite kind of thing. Very romantic.
Well, he was painting in the 20s and the teens. He left Russia after his parents died in the famines, and he settled in the U.S. He was famous for doing portraits, and he settled in the U.S. and did pictures of Native Americans, and that was his claim to fame. But he's kind of a post expressionist portrait painter and uses a lot of colors but
that's odd, because the one thing he describes about it, the reason why he says the painting is so good, is he says it's so realistic looking.
And that realistic paintings are going to come up again.
But that's, if we're thinking about sort of art history periods, realism seems like it would be pushed back a little bit more, or at least that kind of accurate realism. But I'm not exactly sure. We don't know much about the other guy, right? Cortiosa, also a saint's name. The only thing that I found about these saints is both of them founded monasteries, which I thought was interesting when we're talking about them in a guild and sort of collecting groups of people. That's the one thing that I could find that really brought these guys together.
Well, Rudesind kind of reveals that he's not a fan of abstract art, I think. He says that Cortiosa was better than the drippers and spitters. They're wild for nowadays. So
yeah, drippers and spitters, that's supposed to be like Jackson Pollock.
That's what my thought.
Yeah,
we're talking about abstract art.
Yeah. So realism versus classic versus modern. It's sort of some typical thing there. Could be. And then he says that, we get the stuff that the house absolute doesn't want. And so he's sort of making fun of the stuff, which makes you wonder. I mean, Thecla will talk about how, it was all about fashion and wearing special clothes for certain parts of the day, and that sort of very surface thing. So the idea that art is appreciated more for the fashion of the moment will seem to fit with that, I guess, stereotype.
And that is the thing he mentions, is that if the art is here in the galleries, it means that it's not popular right now.
Right. That it comes here to die. It comes here
or
to get
until
lost.
it comes back in fashion, and then it'll go back to house absolute.
So he says this is the third time that he's cleaned the painting, and we kind of get a glimpse into what a curator's life is like, because he talks about how he cleaned it once when an apprentice to Bran Wallader, which I think is just a cool name. That one always seems like a Dickensian name to me.
Yeah, well, it's a British saint, so it makes...
Oh, there you go. But yeah, so he's done it 3 times. Once when he was young, was kind of taught to clean with it. And then he talks about how you go down in one corner and you go very, very carefully up to do it. Then he says one other time when his wife was still living, which, by the way, that's the first time we hear about someone in a guild being married.
Yeah, that's true.
No one in the Torturers Guild is married. Well, apart from the Bear Tower.
Well, the Bear Tower they all get married. They're all family men. So,
but so then she's died, and now he's doing it. I guess one thing we could point out too, that since relations and genealogies are so important to people, he does talk about how he had a second daughter.
Right.
For that, I haven't looked up to see if other people have talked about possibly who his daughters might be, but I'm sure somewhere out there
there must have been a theory developed. Although I haven't seen any reference to his family. That's obvious.
Yeah. But then he says he cleans it again just because he wanted to, that he's gotten to that point in his life where he can do it, even though it doesn't really need it.
He was looking for something to do.
But he doesn't say if it's something about that painting in particular, or if he's cleaned a whole bunch of paintings a lot. But it did make me wonder, okay, well, is this a particularly unique painting for any other reason? It's not, from what they describe, it's not placed in any particular site of honor or anything like that. Yeah. He says, today I took the notion to clean it again, and it needs it. See how nice it's brightening up. Then he has a phrase, which I guess we can say, says, there's your blue earth coming over his shoulder again, fresh as the autark's fish.
That thing at the end, the autark's fish.
Yes, that, but also, just to point this out, I don't buy this, but some people say, okay, as soon as he says, there's your earth, that means he's a Cacogen or something else.
Yeah.
I have to admit, I don't buy that part, just because he's been presented as speaking in a very sort of casual way.
And there's nothing alien about his upbringing. I mean, Wolfe is very good at making the strange ordinary and the ordinary strange, but still, it's possible, but I would like it would be good to land on top of some other evidence, but I don't think anyone has any other evidence.
Right. There are a couple other things we might talk about, but first let's talk about that autarch's fish. The first reference we get to fresh as your autarch's fish. Now, I think when you first read this, it could well be fresh as the fish that he eats for dinner.
Yeah, that's exactly.
We are also going to know about another fish.
Yeah, we're going to encounter some more fish when we get to Father Anir's mirrors, right?
Yep. With this one, I wonder if it's more of a game, a kind of fun hint that Wolfe's put in there. But because of one of those stranger theories that comes up, it might have to do with something else. So, but I guess we can hold off on that.
Well, that's the other thing is, yeah, we don't have to go into it, but there's a theory that he's Father Anir himself.
Right. And I think the main supposed clue to that is because he describes him as an aged monkey. And the one thing that we are told about Father Anir over and over and over again is that he's monkey-like or simian or something like that. So anytime, and there are a few other characters who are described as monkey-like or primate-like or something like that.
Yeah, those monkeyish arms keep showing up, and hairy red arms.
Right. So when you have that, combine that with the idea that that he mentions fresh as the autarch's fish when he's doing his little show off of the mirrors to Thekla's friend. They're summoning what they call a light fish or a fish made of light. Plus, I think the other thing that makes people wonder is because here's a figure who is going to help Severian get somewhere. And since, again, we're sort of jumping way ahead of ourselves, but since Anir is someone who seems to be working to try to make sure that the right person becomes autarch, that this would be a moment when he could be helping Severian to get to Master Alton, to get the books, to do something else. Now, all that could be just giving him directions down the hallway. Doesn't seem like, Father Anir would have to go through a whole lot of trouble to disguise himself and leave the House Absolute and get to this particular point and do all this thing just to send him directions. That would be very odd.
Well, what if imagine he had taken the Armiger's advice, which we find out is bad directions, and it had taken him all day to finally get to Master Alton, if at all. And he ended up not finding Master Alton himself at all. Maybe he ended up talking to someone else who took the message from him. I suppose that's entirely possible. The reason I bring this up is that another time we're going to encounter Rudesind is at the very end of Citadel of the Autarch. And he's going to come to him bearing a message from Father Anir. And they're going to have a conversation that's strange, I think. It's like they're talking, but they're not really getting to the point of something that's really important. The only purpose of the conversations to me seems to be that Rudesind is maybe important.
And if that's the case, then we do actually have Severian interacting with Father Anir, which is one thing that has often been pointed out, is that otherwise Father Anir is never presented in the actual narrative, that he's always presented through someone else. When we get the story of his mirrors, that's Severian remembering Thekla, remembering her friend's story about Father Anir, right? It's like there are always all these layers between the real Father Anir and actually Severian. But here he would be here, but in a kind of disguise.
It's hard for me to get there, though. I mean, if Rudesind were Father Anir disguised, he's disguised as himself, rather than Father Anir, a Cacogen, so the text tells us he is. He doesn't seem to be wearing much of a disguise, is what I'm saying in this case. He looks like a person, and he talks about real life events. And generally, when people talk like this in a Wolfe story, I tend to believe that there's some truth to it.
One other bit of information that could lead to that is that the actual Saint Rudesind was both a political leader and a warrior, and that he did in Spain both rule certain areas, but also led people in a lot of the battles in Spain. And so it's one of the few times where it seems to me like the saint's name would fit one of those theories pretty well. But again, this is another place where, I don't know, we'll need to come back to it, when we do talk about Citadel and have a bunch of, we know a lot more about Father Anir. But at this point, I go back and forth. If it hadn't been for the monkey thing, I wouldn't buy it at all. But as soon as he specifically mentions monkey, that to me seems like one of those things that Wolfe will do, where he does in all of his works, in all of his books or stories, have certain descriptions of certain people that are supposed to clue you in that something's going on. Monkeys for Father Anere, the heart-shaped face and the olive skin with Catherine and with a number of other other women. So the fact that he throws in here doesn't seem like he'd be just throwing in a red herring.
Yeah, it's hard to connect those two dots. They are. I admit that the monkey arms thing when that came up in the Earth list was very attractive to me because I liked all of the reference.
Yeah, it's one of the hardest things to dismiss, because then you're like, oh, but he's so intentional about describing people as monkey.
And yet he goes over, and they come up over and over again in this particular book. And it's not like in every other novel he has someone with monkey arms. It's literally in this book that you have that.
Right.
Severian wants to talk to him more about Vodalus. He's kind of suspects that the reason he came down in the first place because that Severian had mentioned Vodalus, and he thinks maybe he's a secret follower. And so he, just to keep him talking, because he seems to know more than he's asking. He's asking just questions that he kind of understands the answer to. He says, "Is that the moon? I've been told it's more fertile." And Rudesind said, "Well, now it is. Yes, this was done before they got it irrigated. See that gray brown? In those times, that's what you'd see when you looked up at her. Not green like she is now. Didn't seem so big either because it wasn't so close in. That's what old Brandwallader used to say. Now there's trees enough to hide Nilamon, as the saw goes." It's an old saying. Yeah, as a saying. Nilamon, who Nilamon was and why he was so hard to hide is a story that never gets told.
The Saint Nilamon, there is a Saint Nilamon, did not want to become a bishop and actually hid.
He starved himself, right?
Was that it? Oh, I didn't. That's the version I found didn't have that.
Oh, that's a good point. I didn't think of himself as hiding. He shut himself up and basically prayed and starved. And everyone would say, "Please stop." And he just kept praying and not eating.
Yeah.
Trees enough to hide Nilamon. And Severian says, or Vodalus, if Rudesind is a secret Vodalere he doesn't let on. He says, "Yeah, that's right. You torturers must be rubbing your hands at the prospect of getting a hold of him. Got anything special planned?" And, the torturers don't plan special treatments for individuals, but Severian, playing it cagey, says, "We'll think of something." And Rudesind does the same. He says, "I'm sure you will. I was thinking before that you were on his side, but you'll have to wait if he's hiding in the Forest of Loon." And then he directs him to Master Olton.
So before we leave Rudesind behind, just a couple other little things that come up. He tells Severian twice that they have a Fechin, which I thought was odd, that he says, "Why, this is the best part. We got art, music, and books. We have a Fechin here that shows blah, blah, blah." And then he describes a few other things. He says the thing about the House Absolute doesn't want it. And then at the bottom, he says, "We've got a Fechin here. It's the truth." But he's already mentioned it. And so it's hard to know, okay, is he just being really enthusiastic and intentionally repeating himself? Or is he drawing attention to Fechin? Other people are going to have possibly interacted with Fechin later on. So he could be trying to repeat that, again, going into the theory that this is Father Anere, it might be mentioning Fechin multiple times to really drive that idea home to Severian. Could well be. Not really sure. When he's talking about Vodalus to Rudesind sort of pokes fun at him and says, "A minute ago, I thought you were for him." Another point where probably based on how he describes Rudesind talking, it's just, again, being playful, kind of just messing with him. But it could be another point. It's where Severian, in his still very young, naive way here, I think, mentions that as if to evidence that he might be caught up in a grand conspiracy.
Well, if he's Father Anere, then, he's part of who has been propping Vodalus up all these times. So,
yep. So, yeah, we will get back to Rudesind later, but that's what we get. He gives him different directions, says that where the Armigers told him to go the way I took this, they told him basically to go to the main entrance, was what it seemed like, where he'd probably just have to sit and wait for a while.
The reading room, he says.
Yes, exactly. And what Rudesind tells him is, here's how to get down close to where his actual office is.
Right. He says it would take him 4 hours to get to Olton if he ever got there at all.
Right. Again, which fits that idea of this being leagues
Right.
and leagues. So it is, that's actually a good point there. That makes me think that when he talks about it being, having walked for a league, maybe that really was literal instead of just saying I walked for a long time.
Yeah. So he gives him directions through this arched doorway to get there directly, get to Olton directly. His directions include taking stairs downward. That makes Severian worried that he could end up in the tunnels under the Mansion Tower again. The arch of the doorway is held up by pillars with sleeping faces at the top, which creeps Severian out. He mentions that the Mansion Tower has agonized masks painted on its metal as well.
Right. So having these faces seems to be pretty customary for maybe the guilds or different areas. The fact that you're going to have sleeping faces over an archive is creepy because it means that this is just a place where things go to stay, but it's not actively used. It's not a place of learning. And the way Master Alton's going to talk about it, that's kind of true.
Yeah.
That's, I think, where he talks about he used to read the books. Now he just wants them as physical objects. And yeah, he's just about maintaining things and keeping it pretty dormant, not about actually using it. I also want to see what the agonized masks look like, images of people in pain. But very similar, I think, to theater masks of, happy and sad, comedy and tragedy. That's what I immediately thought of.
Based on the idea of the geography, I thought of perhaps, Aztec or Mayan style masks of some sort that, he says are agonized, but there are many ways to very stylistically represent agonized in that way. They all look agonized to some extent.
Cool. Well, it's also they were faces that are on the tops of pillars, the capitals. The ones on the Mansion Tower are just painted on, which I thought was kind of cool. Like an idea that, how well were those done? I don't know.
Yeah. And he mentions here again, it's the metal of the tower.
He does go down, and when he follows the directions, does get dark for the second time.
Before he goes there, he goes through a room where every picture has a book in it. Sometimes it's not obvious. You have to look hard to find the book, but it's always there.
Which seemed very thematic. The idea that as you're getting closer to the library, the pictures are fitting what you're going to see. Yeah. Which I think should also make you think, okay, well, where was he heading when the pictures were about the moon? Or where was he heading when the pictures were about wings like leeches?
Oh, that's a good point. It could, if it's thematic, maybe it has something to do with space travel or something. So, the woman in the mortuary mask, she could be, that could be a spacesuit. Who knows?
Towards the necropolis, possibly. Yeah. But that at least seemed to be one thing that's an immediate question. But then it gets too dark. He has to walk with his hands stretched out in front of him.
Because he's afraid. He's told he's going to come to a locked door. And so he's thinking about that. Right. He goes, it's a spiral staircase. It has no railings. He has to go 30 steps and then he's in almost total darkness. He's got his hands stretched out so he doesn't. And then he gets to the last step and he kind of tries to take the next step and stumbles a bit. And he says, I was left to grope across an uneven floor in total darkness. And then clang, he says, who's there? A voice called. It was a strangely resonant one that's like the sound of a bell tolled inside a cave.
And that audible image is something we're going to get a few more times because Alton's voice is a very unique voice.
It's not the only place we're going to hear about a bell tolling either.
Correct. So when he does go down here, I know some people have wondered, well, is this a totally different direction that he went? To me, what I think we're supposed to think is that the door was just open and it could have been recently opened. Has someone recently walked through this way to get up here? Or is it just thoughtlessness or carelessness we do find out what kind of disarray the library is in.
Well, Olton is right there. So he could be, he could have just opened that door and he doesn't need the lights on because he's blind.
True. So yeah, this is one where we end it's not a big dramatic moment, but when you had mentioned before that this and the next chapter could be a pair. Yeah. This could just well be.
Yeah. It just feels like this was originally a chapter and he decided, well, this is so much longer than all the other chapters.
Yeah. Well, we've already mentioned some strange theories, But should we do Curiositas Earthus?
Yeah.
Curiositas Earthus.
So there are a lot of things that are already odd about Rudesind, and some I still feel like long stretches of speculation to get people there. I think the one that went really, really far to me was I did find someone who suggested that Rudesind is a hierogrammic. That one seemed to get really far. And it had to do with Rudesind possibly also being Father Inire. Now, it is possible to go way down the line a bit that Inire could be like Zadkiel. Mm-hmm. He could be a Hyro or Hierogrammet or whichever version or level we want to talk about. But there was one theory that said that Rudesind himself was a different form of Inire, not Inire in disguise, but actually another form of Inire, where Inire takes forms of different people and appears in different ways, just like supposedly, or on their reading, Zadkiel does in Earth of the New Sun, take different forms at different times. It got really weird. This one was on the Earth list, and it got really complicated in the sense of thinking about Inire, again, not being in disguise in different places, but actually metaphysically appearing at different points of space and time. And that this person thought was a better explanation of how Rudesind and Inire could be the same person, rather than just Inire being in disguise.
I think that some of his different shapes involved actually being an ape or a monkey, or at least some people have interpreted it that way.
And that could be. But then to make the further jump that Rudesind is then also a different metaphysical projection of Inire at different points, that's when I start to sort of lose my bearings. exactly what would be going on.
Once you get to a level of too much complexity, I often feel like you. I feel like, okay, at some point, why do I care about this? What am I gaining from this anymore?
The other curiosity I found was someone who, and I'll say this is a curiosity, but this one I feel actually intrigued by it, which is the idea that we've gotten it wrong when we think we know what this astronaut is, then that the painting they thought was actually of a different moon landing. This one went so far as to say the fact that it's really hard to find a single image that has all the components that Wolfe describes of the astronaut, the gold plate, so it has to be in color, the flag, and the Earth in the background, that specifically means that we're in a different timeline. And the reason that one gets hard for me is that would assume then that Wolfe had sort of gone through all the available moon images and very specifically described one
that wasn't there,
that we didn't have.
Yeah.
Really cool, if possible, but starts to just step over that line of speculation.
But if it's in another timeline, why not just assume it's a later date? That for, if something pre-1980 for a moon landing, I mean, at some point they're going to have to go back to the moon and do things before they end up, foresting it.
And when they're talking about their history, even when they talk about what's ancient history for them, that can still easily be our future.
Exactly.
So there's a lot of different options in there. But I did think that one was interesting, but the idea that we could prove that this is a different timeline or not the Earth of our future, because there is no particular photograph of any moon landing that exactly fits Wolfe's things. I thought that was pretty ingenious. Don't buy it, but I thought it was ingenious.
But then I keep thinking, well, this is no one ever. I guess they could. He always says pictures, so they could be photographs, but photographs fade, and in a way that you can. Pictures produce their colors, more physically. So, I mean, after, tens of thousands of years, I'm sure there's no way any kind of painting would survive either. But so I guess that doesn't really.
Especially not if it's being washed with water from a bucket. Over and over again.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And that he's got like a rag and a bucket.
Well, maybe these paintings all have glass covers on them.
Now that could be
and so they never get sooty, but the glass does.
Could well be. And it seems like if they're good curators, then and we're talking about things that are tens, if not hundreds of thousands years old, then hopefully they'd be
I
well
hope they would
preserved.
use something to say, yeah, they maybe all have argon or something in the.
Yeah. Still weird that they'd have to wipe smoke off of the front of it, though.
Yep. But
who knows?
If they've got torches and everything on there, I can't remember whether they have bulbs like down in the oubliette that are supposed to never burn out. But I think they also have, but they can't produce more of them. So there must be a lot of torches in use.
Right. Yeah, they're not supposed to burn out, but a few of them had. Well, good. Well, everyone, thank you for listening. If you do have comments, especially if you have solutions to our questions of the Inire Rudesind connection, or think you did find one of those paintings, would love to know. Please get in touch with us at Twitter or Facebook.
And we'll talk about it.
Even if we're episodes down the line and you're listening to this a long time ago, we're certainly happy to go back and mention things that have come up chapters and chapters before. So don't feel like if you're not listening to the latest one, you can't comment on something we said, because I think we're more than happy to go back and mention earlier things.
Yeah, we're bound to not to be able to resist commenting on that,
which is fun. And things are going to come back, as we just talked about how Rudesind will show up. Does he come up twice again?
He comes at least twice. I think no, he only comes up. He shows up in House Absolute, and then he comes to him at House Absolute at the end of Citadel Otter.
At the end, okay, yeah. So 2 other times, yeah. So Rudesind will certainly show up again. Other people and characters and events will show up again. So let us know. Twitter, Facebook. Otherwise, I think we will see you next time as we dive deeper into the very dark library with Master Olton.
Terrific.
Thanks for listening.
The sun come up, it was blue and gold. The sun come up, it was blue and gold. The sun come up, it was blue and gold. Ever since I put your picture in a frame, I come calling in my Sunday bed.
Oh, you know what? Oh, I can't even talk about that yet because it hasn't come out yet. Fascinating. This is fascinating. This is intriguing.